Welcome to Module 1 of What is it like to adopt a child? The topic for our time today is Getting Started. We will be covering important foundational concepts and details that you will need to know as you set out to adopt a child. If you are new to our company, let me take a brief moment to introduce us to you. This course is created by the coaches at Growing Intentional Families Together. We are an adoption coaching firm that specializes in adoption education and support because we believe that adoption attuned parenting truly grows happier, healthier adoptive families. Our company is comprised of 4 certified coaches: Sally Ankerfeld, Sharon Butler Obaze, Susan David, and Gail Swift. So, welcome, and let's get started. I am Sally Ankerfeld, the adoption coach who will be guiding you through this module. I am happy to present this material with the benefit of the way my own family was formed. I am an adoptive parent of 3 now adult children. Between the 3 of them, I have experienced an open adoption, an international adoption, and an adoption from foster care. I was once where you are now. You've likely already discovered that the adoption process is complicated, and you may find yourself wondering, where do I begin? Well, you certainly are in the right place. This course is a great way to become educated and prepared and reduce the anxiety that you might be feeling. If you are like I was before my husband and I adopted our first child, we had an idea of what we wanted our family to be like. We pictured attending our children's activities. We thought about those family vacations and all the fun times around the table. So, in the beginning, we had a dream that motivated us to decide to adopt. My husband and I discovered quite quickly that it was important for us to move from this world of dreams so that we had space in our brains and in our lives to learn the facts and the information that would help us become loving, competent, adoptive parents. Just like creating a family through giving birth, but I would have to say even more so with adoption, it is important to deal with the reality versus the wishful thinking that we all have when we enter into the idea of parenting. It's important to do this so that we do not become disillusioned. For most couples, having children involves just 2 people. When adopting a child, a lot more people are involved. You have the social workers, lawyers, bankers, counselors, not to mention expectant mothers and fathers, healthcare personnel, and of course, the child or the children who are in need of adoptive parents. There are actually even more people involved than this, but I think you get the idea. And each person has their priorities, their agendas, and responsibilities. You are probably thinking right now that that is a lot of influence to juggle, and it is. I can attest to that. The process when we adopted our children, each time it was a little different, and each time there were some complications, some surprises, and some longer periods of time than we expected. But of course, it was very worth it. I'm also guessing that some of you have a partner, not just you, but somebody else making the journey with you. That is another layer that you may be wondering about. It's likely that one of you brought up the idea of adopting to the other. I was the one who approached my husband about adopting an older child because I was the one who was one night watching a waiting child show on television. Afterwards, I felt deeply moved to adopt an older child. And to be honest, it took my husband a bit off guard. We already had 2 small children in the home, and it was a busy household already. Another child, and an older child at that. This was a lot for him to absorb. This is just one example of the complication, or the extra layer, I should say, of having a partner to consider when we are thinking and embarking on adoption. We at Growing Intentional Families Together understand that kind of layer. We've been there, many of us, trying to navigate with another partner, co-captaining the ship. There can be a lot going on within this dynamic when we start that process of adopting a child. All modules in this course will give you solid information to help you prepare yourself, a partner if you have one, your extended family, and your friends for this journey of adoption. Adoptive families do not exist in a vacuum. We are part of the world, and it matters how the world, your friends, family, partners, it imagines how the world understands, accepts, and supports us, or not. As the saying goes, it does take a village to raise a child. It's essential that everyone within this adoption constellation has accurate and thorough information, and it begins with you, your partner if you have one, and it moves outward to your extended family, your child's birth family, your community, and every circle in which you exist. I want to take a moment to mention another part of the adoption constellation that we may not think about very often. So, I mentioned expectant parents and extended family, prospective adoptive parents, their extended families, friends, community connections, and of course the child in the center of it all. But what I haven't mentioned yet is another group of people, connections that can be very near and dear to each of us. Have you ever heard the term ghost kingdom? It is an important concept in adoptee family life. It refers to all of the people that adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents think about. For birth parents, it is the child they placed for adoption, and perhaps all the people, including the adoptive parents, that the child has in their lives. For adoptive parents, the ghost kingdom might include the biological children they imagined they would have but never conceived. For adoptees, it can be their missing birth parents whom they hold in their minds and hearts. The ghost kingdom also includes the wanderings that adoptees have about themselves from two different angles. The wanderings of who they might have become if they had never been adopted, and also who they might be if they had been adopted by a different family. The term ghost kingdom was coined by adoptee counselor and adoptee rights activist Betty Jean Lifton. She asserted, and I quote, "The story of adoption is a ghost story full of fantasy, mystery, and missing persons who for the most part are as if dead, unlike respectable ghosts who are unambiguously dead. These ghosts spring from the depths of unresolved grief, loss, and trauma that the adoption triad has experienced. They represent the lost babies, the parents who lost them, and the parents who found them. They are consigned to a spectral place I call Ghost Kingdom." Unquote. Perhaps you are realizing that when you become an adoptive family, your family unit will not just be you and your child or children, but it will be a host of other people that will influence you, your child, and your family. Now that you have heard a bit more about the adoption constellation, and now that you've heard about the ghost kingdom, perhaps you may be wondering a little more about open or closed adoption. What most people call a closed adoption is currently known as a traditional adoption. Because of the availability of information on the internet, those DNA tests I mentioned, and because most women who choose adoption for their child want to continue some degree of contact, practically speaking, traditional adoption no longer exists. I have learned personally that it was inaccurate for me to expect that adopting internationally would erase the first parents from my child's life. In fact, the inability to have knowledge or contact often causes the adopted child deep emotional pain. Mentioned or unmentioned, physically present or not, when a person adopts a child, the child's family comes with them in their biology, in their hearts and minds. This is true even in cases of international adoption where contact may be unlikely or impossible. So, open or closed, it is a decision made by the first mother, not the social workers or the prospective adoptive parents. It is wise to think about what type of relationship you can handle. If you ask for a closed adoption, it will most likely make it more difficult to adopt. Fortunately, the views on adoption have changed through the years, where more so now than ever, adoption is about finding families for children, not about finding children for parents. This is because adoption is now more child-centric. We know that in most cases, contact with first families is healthier than no contact. Adoptive parents do have some choice here, but certainly the first mother is the one who determines if she wants an open or traditional adoption. She would be entrusting her child to you, and so she would want to know that they are thriving and safe. Like any relationship, having a clear understanding of what the expectations are for contact between the adoptive parent and the birth mother, that is, of course, healthy and a good foundation for all involved, especially the child. And abiding to the agreement is also very important. I might add that in the case of older children who are in a home, contact with some member or members of the birth family most often is a goal because this connection is of such great benefit to the child. What about open adoption? Understanding the legal process of adoption is really helpful when it comes to one very common question: can my child's birth mother come back or change her mind? Well, this is virtually impossible legally, not to mention the fact that most expectant mothers do not make an adoption decision without careful thought. It is a painful decision full of many emotions, including loss, sadness, and perhaps guilt and shame. We've come a long ways in understanding that most often an open adoption is best for the child. This does not mean that the adoptive parents co-parent with the first mother or father. It means that the adoptive family and the birth mother and birth family are all focused on the best interest of the child whom they all love. It may or may not include physical contact. Ideally, an open adoption includes emotional openness. To learn more about the benefits and challenges of open adoption, we invite you to read Lori Holden's book, The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption. Currently, almost all adoptions are open to some degree. It is important to know that many expectant mothers who are considering placing their children or child for adoption have some degree of openness listed as a factor in their decision to opt for adoption. While open adoption agreements are not legally binding in most states, adoptive parents are ethically bound to make every effort to sustain an open adoption relationship. Contact is on a continuum from very little to a lot. Communication can range from sending letters and photos to an agreement to meet regularly, perhaps include phone calls, and even maybe joint holiday and or family events. While this may sound kind of startling at first, many of us have probably experienced a similar blending of families, either through a remarriage that joins two families that include children, or simply through blending two families together in partnerships. Now that we have the general framework of adoption, like who is involved and the level of openness, there is much more to consider before you adopt. As you will see, it's not just let's adopt a child, but what types of adoption are available and what might I consider given my life and circumstances. On this slide, you can see some of the considerations. As a coach, I see all of these as exciting. As coaches, we can guide you through the pros and cons and help you identify the situations that will work for you. Complete honesty with yourself is truly important. Truthfulness will benefit you and your prospective child. Yes, let's explore the possibilities that you might not initially be comfortable with. And then, once you do that, you can be certain that your ultimate choice is one that you can live with. There is a place for both flexibility and honesty. You will want to find the balance. Of course, these are just some of the things that you will need to consider. But of course, there is more. You will need to consider the pathway to your adoption. If you choose to adopt in the United States, it's called a domestic adoption. Here we have highlighted the three paths to adoption in the United States: public, private, and independent. Each state has its own laws governing adoption, but there are many similarities between them. For example, an adoption cannot take place without the termination of parental rights. There's also something called the Interstate Compact, which requires compliance with the laws of the adoptive parent's home state and of the sending state where the child lives. The state path is through your state's Department of Child Welfare or Child Services, and there you will likely find adoption through foster programs or special needs and waiting children. Lots of people who provide adoption-related services, like facilitators and online matching companies, are not licensed. They don't have to go through a state government's rigorous vetting process. In an independent adoption, where there is no involvement of adoption professionals, there is more risk for both the expectant mother and the adoptive parent. Since there might be less oversight and a lack of an understanding of the adoption complexities, people handling independent adoptions may cross the lines of state laws that prohibit specific types of support to the expectant mother that might persuade that mother to place her child for adoption. This can make the expectant mother vulnerable in her time of need and in her time of uncertainty. The expectant mother is at risk because she often does not get adequate counseling before adoption. Both the unethical practices and lack of education raise the possibility that a birth mother may change her mind. So this puts really the adoptive parents at risk emotionally and possibly financially, in addition to the expectant mother. Often also with independent adoptions, adoptive parents may have had little education as to the lifetime ramifications of adopting. And most importantly, the child's well-being is at risk without adequate adoption education for both the expectant mom and the prospective adoptive parents. Another choice you will need to make is the type of adoption you are considering. Infant adoption, adopting from foster care, fostering to adopt, and also kinship adoption are some of the types that you may be considering as you think about adopting a child. When people think of adopting a baby, most think of a newborn, but it could also mean a child who is somewhat older than a newborn, even to the child who is 12, 15, 16 months old, maybe even 2 years old. Some people's decision to adopt or not can be greatly influenced by how much of a chance they have to receive an infant. Please refer to the references at the end of this module for current statistics. But generally speaking, fewer and fewer infant adoptions are occurring each year. It is surmised that this is due to a combination of factors. Teen pregnancies have decreased, there's more social acceptance of pregnancy outside of wedlock, international adoptions are fewer because countries are encouraging locating adoptive families within their own countries, which we'll talk about briefly a bit later. These are all trends that have a great chance of benefiting the child, but also reduce the availability and the need for adoption with younger children. Another pathway to adopting is adopting from foster care. Maybe some of you have heard of the term waiting child. This means that a child is available for adoption because the parental rights have been terminated or are in the process of being terminated. To give you a picture of who these children are, they are most likely, on the average, 7.5 years old as of 2021 statistics, and they are from a variety of racial backgrounds. Some children who are part of this average are over the age of 12. In fact, 6,000 children over the age of 12 were adopted in 2021, and of those, 127 were over age 18. More than 25,000 teens were still waiting to be adopted at the end of 2021. As you hear these numbers, perhaps you can surmise that children in foster care have had a difficult road. There is some kind of trauma involved for the child to be in foster care in the first place. Many of these children also face losses and confusion when they are moved from one foster care home to another and maybe even another. Some children are living in institutional care settings. Can you imagine what a child may have gone through? And then to add to that the uncertainty, perhaps for years, of not knowing when or if you will be able to go home. If you were to adopt a child from care, you would need the primary qualities of steadfastness and patience. And if you are considering adopting a child who is older or in foster care, you will need to know that he will have experiences that have shaped him into the person he is now, and that he is a unique person in his own right. His social worker will seek an adoptive family that would be a good match for that child. And then your social worker and the child's social worker will talk to each other and communicate the personalities of both parties, the child's needs and your ability to meet those needs. So it's better for you and for the child if the social worker knows you well, which means that this process does have quite a bit of conversation and time with social workers. Since the number of children in need of adopting is declining, especially infants, some people are turning to foster care in hopes that an infant or toddler that they would be fostering may eventually be in need of a permanent home. Viewing fostering an infant in this way as an avenue to adopting a child can be in direct conflict with the purpose of foster care, which is to provide a safe home for a child while the parents work on stability or health. Unless the parent's parental rights have been terminated, there is a strong possibility the child will be reunited with their parents. A child could be with you for a few months to a few years before they can be reunited with their family. That being said, many states have foster to adopt programs where the children in need of foster care have a family situation where the termination of parental rights is likely to occur. With these programs, your intentions to adopt would be a prerequisite to being a part of the program. Even then, there is no guarantee. Here's the bottom line. If you were to become a foster parent in hopes of adopting a child, if you would enter into a fostering to adopt situation, you would have to have the mindset that this child may not become available to you to adopt. It takes a unique person to be able to love a child unconditionally with the knowledge that the child may not be in their home forever. In this situation, were you to consider this path, you would need to be flexible. You would need to make sure that your foster child is available, for instance, for parental visits, or to be prepared for your foster child going home for a weekend or weeks-long visit, and to be open to relating to that child's first family. It would be important not to judge the parent's situation, as that would be very painful and very messy for everybody, but most especially the child. Another pathway that some people consider is adopting a sibling group. It's an instant family. In most cases, it is important that siblings should stay together, and that most likely will be a goal of an adoption social worker who is working in the foster care system. Consider this choice carefully before the option could be placed in front of you. Think about the ramifications. Would you have enough resources, time, energy, and support to accommodate more than one child? In some rare cases, it is considered healthier to separate the sibling as long as they can be assured of contact in the future. This means that for you, as a prospective adoptive parent of siblings, you would need to know that children in the sibling group can struggle sometimes with releasing control. They can have some difficulties with learning to trust adults, that they would be reliable and stable, and they may rely on each other a great deal as siblings. If you don't feel capable of adopting an entire sibling group, you might be able to adopt one or more as long as you promise that you will let them stay in touch with each other and that you keep this promise. Another pathway to adopting is considering adopting a child who has and does experience added challenges. When you decide to adopt, you will at some point be asked to fill out a lengthy questionnaire, a form that asks what you would be willing to consider in terms of physical, emotional, and behavioral challenges and medical challenges. It's important to be honest with yourself and others about whether you can manage any type of these special situations. You would want to make sure that your heart and mind have equal say in deciding what you can handle. Discovering that it is too much after a child is placed in your family would be disastrous for them and for you. So there are emotional challenges that some children face. If you decide to adopt an older child, you would want to make sure that you've got accurate and complete information about their challenges and any trauma that they have experienced. Before you commit to adopting that child, as much information as possible is the most important thing, because knowledge is power. Did you know also that for behavioral challenges, even a baby can have some challenges, like failing to make eye contact or leading to some distance feelings while you are trying to comfort the baby? These can have big implications. As far as older children go, behavioral challenges might be easier to identify. Maybe they will show up in social interactions at school, for instance. The same holds true for learning issues. Learning issues often show up later rather than earlier because when a child is younger, learning does not require as much critical thinking or long attention spans. But by the time a child is 7 or 8, you might start to see them having challenges in, say, math, for example. These are just a few examples of some of the special needs that a child may have. We did not touch on the medical or the physical so much as the emotional and behavioral, because those two tend to be a little bit more difficult to identify, but just as important as the other needs listed here. Religion can be an additional layer that you might have to integrate into your family, more so with an older child who has already identified with a particular religion. Although I will say, with one of my children who was adopted as an infant, their religion of birth became more important to them as they grew older. And a child may be from a different culture, which we'll be talking about more later. But that is another factor that plays out into the future. How will you acknowledge that as your child grows? My husband and I adopted 3 children of another race, and we are white. I can tell you firsthand that being raised by parents outside of one's race and culture is not easy for children. If you would be raising a child of another race, it is imperative to know that you would become a multiracial family that would call on you to make major changes for the sake of your child, such as moving to a diverse community, a community where they can see themselves reflected in that community, expanding your network of friends to include people of all cultures, especially your child's culture. Another pathway to adoption is international adoption. People choose to adopt internationally for a variety of reasons. It might be less expensive, depending on what kind of domestic adoption you are comparing it to. Sometimes children are waiting to be placed in a particular country, or for some reason, the prospective parents were closed out of domestic adoptions, or some want a closed adoption. We already talked about that closed is not the healthiest choice, and it quite honestly does not exist, as there is always a first family present in a child's mind and heart, no matter how far away they are. For the health and well-being of children, countries are seeing the importance of promoting adoption within their own country instead of allowing their children to be adopted into other countries. Some long established entities within the United States also recognize this and therefore are no longer facilitating international adoptions. International adoption numbers have plummeted in recent years. Now, some countries do change their policies from time to time, especially if there is a health or medical issue for a younger child, or if the child is 6 years old or older, that they will allow a child to be adopted outside of their own country. It is essential that you research the latest guidelines for other country adoptions. Compliance with the Hague Convention, which is the protection for the child against trafficking, is also a very important factor. So make sure that this is honored by the agency, and that would be a question for you to ask every agency that you are contemplating using. Some agencies have solid relationships with other countries as well. This can help to ensure that the children truly need homes. I also want to lift up a few other current trends in adoption. Adoptions are decreasing in general, but infant adoptions in particular. Professionals from the field report fewer expectant parents requesting adoption counseling and fewer placements being made with the involvement of agencies and attorneys. It is hard to pin down the number of adoptions that occur in the United States each year, but we can glean some information from public agencies who report to their state. In 2021, the median age of children adopted from public agencies was age 5. 2% were less than a year old. As I mentioned, These numbers do not include children who were adopted through private agencies, but it does give us a window into adoption trends. You can view your own state's public adoption trends by going to the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. This resource will be listed on the references slide at the end of this module. Another current trend that shows progress is that adoption trauma is being recognized and validated. We are learning more and more about the trauma inherent in adoption. Science has given us a better understanding of how trauma affects our brains. That includes the trauma of loss that all adoptees experience. Another shift that we are seeing are stricter requirements and uniform practices, like requiring a home study for all prospective adoptive parents. This helps assure parents that they are able to be adoptive parents, as well as assuring the agencies. Through education, prospective adoptive parents are better prepared to parent. Another change is the diversity in the makeup of families. This is expanding to include single-parent families and same-sex couples. This other trend is very promising. Adoptees' concerns are now voiced and being heard, such as the right to have an original birth certificate. As we touched on before, the popularity of DNA testing has also helped some adoptees whose adoptions originally were closed or who had little to no knowledge of their first families. And finally, because adoptions are more of the rule than the exception, adoptees are able to have more interactions and relationships with their birth families. In every module, we will feature insights from our colleague, Sharon Butler-Obaze. As we mentioned earlier, she is an adult adoptee. Her insights offer personal and valuable perspectives. Sharon writes, "Close your eyes and think about yourself as a child. Imagine the special person who provided you with care and comforting love. Rest for a moment in that treasured memory. Now, just as you recall the comfort and love you experienced, imagine being expected to erase that special person from your mind and to replace them with another person, a stranger. Imagine how that might feel. This replacement is an example of how trauma begins in the psyche of an adopted child. This happens regardless of their background, race, age, and family history. Adoptive parents need to know whatever the child may have missed is ever present in their child's heart and mind." Sharon continues, "Adoption is trauma. I realize that this is a brutal and unwavering statement. If you decide to adopt a baby, a child, a young adult, they have experienced life-altering changes. It's important to recognize this," she concludes. By now you can tell that adoption is full of what I call both ands. Our kids' lives begin before they arrive in our homes. This is especially germane to the understanding of children who were placed for adoption. Certainly, their prenatal experience is a highly stressed pre-birth environment. They also experience stress of relinquishment from their family of origin, as well as the stress of trying to figure out how to fit in and flourish in a new family. For even the youngest adoptees, this struggle occurs, except it's at a pre-verbal sensory level, because they have not yet mastered language. That's a lot of emotional and physical weight for them to carry on their tiny shoulders, and for the birth mother as well. We must not lose sight that our joy is rooted in her heartbreak. Now that you've begun the adoption process and made this decision, you're probably eager to to find out what the timeline is. And as I was when I first embarked on this important part of my life, I wanted it to happen as quickly as possible. However, creating an adoption is very much a collective project. So many people will be involved, and the timeline will be out of your control. You can control your own tasks and responsibilities, and you can ensure that they are completed as thoroughly and promptly as possible. However, you will soon discover that the speed of this whole thing you cannot control because others will be completing their work on your adoption application. And so, though you try to control what you can, which is a good thing, it will be easier on you if you do surrender to this lack of control that is a part of the process. Otherwise, you can drive yourself crazy with frustration. As you complete this first module, there is one important question to ask yourself. Can I move beyond certainty and open my mind to expand my understanding of adoption? I then invite you to consider these questions for yourself or if you have a partner to discuss together. After completing this module, what are you thinking about the most? What aspect of this module surprised you and why? How will you put what you learned in this module into action? We would like to leave you with some closing thoughts from each of us coaches. Sally says, adoption means expanding your family and welcoming your child's birth family and anyone else important to your child. Sharon reflects, the process of adoption can feel overwhelming. It's important to take time for yourself to breathe, to enhance your child-centric environment. Susan says, if you adopt a child from another country, you'll want to make sure to provide meaningful ways, age-appropriate ways, for your child to connect to their birth heritage. And Gail says, open adoptions, while not legally enforceable, carry an ethical and moral responsibility for adoptive parents to honor. Congratulations on completing Module 1. In our next module, you will become acquainted with a variety of adoption professionals, ways to adopt, and the costs of adoption. We invite you to refer to the resource page here that is associated with Module 1 for more information on the topics that were included in this module.